It all started with a letter in the mailbox. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but the envelope had a familiar, dreaded logo, HOA. My heart sank a little as I tore it open. Inside was a notice stating that I had violated a neighborhood rule by parking my truck in the driveway for too long. Seriously, it didn't seem like a big deal. Figured, who cares? But I paid it little attention, thinking it was a one-time issue. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The HOA, and particularly the people in charge, were about to drag me into a nightmare of petty complaints and nonsensical fines. My life was about to turn into a battleground over the smallest things, and I had no idea how far they'd go or how far I'd have to push back to regain control. A week after the first letter, I got hit with another fine. This time, it was for leaving my trash cans out too long after collection day. $1.50. Couldn't believe it. Trash cans? Was that really worth such a steep fine? I paid it because I didn't want to stir the pot, but the hits just kept coming. The grass wasn't trimmed short enough, the mailbox wasn't approved by the HOA, and apparently, my porch decor wasn't aesthetic. The petty violations piled up faster than I could keep up with them. Felt personal. It was like someone had decided I was going to be their target. As the letters and fines stacked higher, I started to get suspicious. Why was I the only one dealing with this level of scrutiny? That's when I decided to dig a little deeper. Something wasn't right, and I was going to find out what was really going on behind the scenes of this HOA nightmare. As the fines continued to roll in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just random enforcement. So, I started talking to my neighbors, asking them if they were getting hit with the same kinds of fines. Most of them shrugged, saying they'd gotten the occasional warning but nothing like what I was dealing with. One neighbor, an older guy named George, gave me a knowing look when I brought it up. "It's Linda," he said. I asked him what he meant, and that's when I learned the truth. Linda, the president of the HOA, had it out for me. Apparently, she didn't like my truck, didn't like that I wasn't involved in the neighborhood events, and basically decided I wasn't a good fit for the community. George told me Linda was known for being a power-hungry tyrant, enforcing rules only when it suited her and turning a blind eye when her favorites broke the same rules. Hearing this made my blood boil. Linda had been targeting me from the start, and it was all because she had some kind of personal vendetta against me. I had never even spoken to her, but somehow I had made an enemy. This wasn't about community standards or improving the neighborhood. It was about control, and I wasn't about to let her walk all over me any longer. The final straw came in the form of a bright, bold letter that made my stomach turn. The HOA, led by Linda, had reviewed my property and decided that my house color didn't conform to the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. They gave me 30 days to repaint my house to a more neutral, acceptable color or face daily fines that would pile up fast. The letter even included a palette of approved colors: beige, light gray, and other drab shades. My house, which I had lovingly painted a warm, inviting blue, was apparently unacceptable. I stood there, staring at the letter, fuming. My house color had never been an issue before, and it wasn't like I had painted it neon green. This was absurd, and I knew this was Linda's doing. Her last petty attempt to push me out. That's when I realized I couldn't take it anymore. Enough was enough. They were clearly abusing their power, and I wasn't going to let it slide. I wasn't just dealing with a few nitpicky fines anymore. This was harassment, plain and simple. If I let them get away with this, what would be next? I made a decision right then and there. I wasn't going to repaint anything. Instead, I was going to fight back. This wasn't just about a house color. This was about standing up to a bully who was drunk on power, and I was ready to show Linda and the HOA that they had pushed me too far. Unsure of what my next steps should be, I decided to seek professional advice. I booked an appointment with a local attorney who specialized in homeowner disputes and HOA regulations. I didn't know much about the legal side of things, but I knew I needed help if I was going to take on the HOA. The lawyer, a sharp guy named Mark, listened carefully as I explained everything. The fines for parking my truck, the trash can nonsense, the unauthorized decorations, and now this ridiculous demand to repaint my house. He nodded along, scribbling notes as I talked, and by the time I finished, He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This is classic HOA overreach," he said. "You'd be surprised how often this kind of thing happens." I was relieved to hear that I wasn't alone, but I was also infuriated. "So, what can I do about it?" "Well," Mark said, "the first thing we need to do is gather evidence. You've got a good case for harassment, but we'll need to prove that they've been unfairly targeting you. The good news is, based on what you've told me, it sounds like we can absolutely fight this." Mark laid out a plan. I would start by collecting every letter, fine, and notice I had received from the HOA. He also suggested that I document everything moving forward, every interaction, every conversation, every violation they claimed I committed. He even advised me to talk to my neighbors and see if they had experienced similar treatment. The more evidence we had, the stronger our case would be. The idea of fighting back filled me with a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about proving a point, it was about standing up for myself and refusing to be bullied. Linda and the HOA had been pushing me around for too long, and now, with Mark's guidance, I had the tools I needed to fight back. I walked out of his office feeling more determined than ever. The next steps were clear. I was going to gather as much evidence as possible, get my neighbors on board, and build a case so strong that Linda and the HOA wouldn't know what hit them. This was just the beginning, and I was ready for the battle ahead. Armed with Mark's advice, I wasted no time getting to work. The first thing I did was dig through every letter and find notice the HOA had ever sent me. I compiled a thick stack of papers, everything from the absurd warning about my truck being in the driveway to the trash can fines and, of course, the ultimatum about repainting my house. I also printed out screenshots of any emails I had received from Linda, particularly the ones with her snide, passive-aggressive remarks. Next, I grabbed a notebook and started documenting every interaction I had with the HOA from that point forward. If I saw Linda walking by my house glaring at my truck, I wrote it down. If I got another ridiculous warning, I recorded the date and time. I even took pictures of my property to show how absurd their claims were. My lawn was neatly trimmed, my porch decorations were tasteful, and my house was one of the best maintained on the block. But the most important step was talking to my neighbors. I started with the ones I knew best, people who had also been fined for minor infractions. I wasn't surprised when they told me they had been dealing with similar harassment from the HOA. One neighbor, Karen, had been fined for leaving a garden hose coiled up in her front yard for too long. Another, Jake, had been slapped with a notice for having overgrown shrubs, even though his landscaping was pristine. As I spoke to more and more neighbors, a pattern began to emerge. Linda and the HOA weren't just nitpicking me. They were targeting several people in the neighborhood, all for the most trivial things. The common thread? None of us were on Linda's good side. She seemed to reserve her worst treatment for those who didn't attend HOA meetings, didn't suck up to her, or in my case, simply owned a truck that didn't fit her idea of a classy neighborhood. With each conversation, I grew more confident that we had a strong case. Mark was right. This was harassment, plain and simple. Linda was abusing her position of power to bully homeowners who didn't conform to her narrow standards. And it wasn't just affecting me. Other people were fed up too, and I was more determined than ever to take her down. I began gathering statements from my neighbors. Some were hesitant at first. No one wanted to be the next target of Linda's wrath. But once they realized they weren't alone, they started opening up. Jake even offered to come with me to the next HOA meeting to support me when I confronted Linda. The more allies I gathered, the stronger my resolve became. It was clear that this fight was about more than just a few fines. It was about taking a stand against an oppressive system that had gone unchecked for too long. Linda had built her little kingdom, and it was time to bring it down. With my evidence piling up and the support of my neighbors behind me, I was ready for the next step. Confronting Linda and the HOA head-on at the next meeting. This time, I wasn't going to sit quietly in the back. This time, I was going to make my voice heard. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I felt a mix of anxiety and adrenaline. I had gathered all my evidence, talked to my neighbors, and had Mark on standby in case I needed any last-minute legal advice. The meeting was being held in the community center, and as I walked in, I could feel Linda's eyes on me from across the room. She was seated at the front with the rest of the board members, a smug look on her face. I took my seat at the back, scanning the room. The usual group of obedient, rule-abiding homeowners were there, nodding in agreement at every word Linda said, hanging on her every command. But something had changed. Word had spread about my lawsuit, and I noticed a few familiar faces from my conversations with the neighbors, Karen, Jake, and a couple others. They weren't there just to watch. They were there to support me. The meeting started with the typical updates: neighborhood events, community projects, and of course, the new fines for anyone violating HOA guidelines. I tried to keep my cool, but I could feel the tension building. Linda went on about how important it was to maintain the high standards of the neighborhood, which I found ironic considering the way she was running the place. As soon as she finished, I stood up. The room went quiet as I walked to the front and addressed the board. I have a few questions, I said, my voice steady. I've been receiving multiple fines, all for minor, insignificant things, and I'm here to find out why. Why is it that I'm being targeted when other neighbors aren't being fined for similar offenses? Why is it that the HOA is focusing on such trivial matters, like a trash can being outside for too long or a truck parked in my driveway? Linda's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered. We enforce the rules equally across the neighborhood, she said, her tone patronizing. All homeowners are held to the same standards. I didn't let her deflect. Is that so? Because I've spoken to several of my neighbors who've also received fines, yet others, like the family down the street with a broken fence, have received no fines at all. Why is that? A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. Linda was starting to feel the heat. We do our best to ensure fairness, she said, her voice tight. But not all situations are the same. That's not good enough, I shot back. I've been given an ultimatum to repaint my house in a color that's acceptable to the HOA. Why? My house looks fine. Are we really going to start policing personal taste now? Linda's face tightened. She wasn't used to being challenged like this in front of the others. I could see the cracks forming in her perfect, ironclad control of the HOA. She quickly dismissed my concerns with a vague answer, but I wasn't done yet. I took a deep breath and said, I'm here to ask that the board reconsider these fines. I have evidence of unfair treatment, and I believe that this level of harassment is not only unnecessary but illegal. If this continues, I will be taking legal action against the HOA for harassment and discrimination. The room fell completely silent. You could hear a pin drop as everyone waited for Linda's response. I glanced at my neighbors. They were all watching, some nodding in support, others looking just as shocked as I felt. Linda opened her mouth to speak, but her words didn't come. She was visibly flustered. Her facade of power was cracking. I could tell she wasn't prepared for this. The rest of the board members looked uncomfortable, not used to having their authority questioned in such a direct way. Let's take a break, Linda finally said, her voice shaky. We'll resume shortly. I turned and walked back to my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. I had done it. I had taken the first real step toward taking Linda down. The ball was in her court now. As the meeting continued, Linda tried to regain control, but I could tell it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been planted. I wasn't just the guy being harassed anymore. I was the guy fighting back, and people were starting to notice. Even those who had once blindly followed her were beginning to question if she was truly fit to lead. The rest of the meeting was a blur. I stayed quiet, but I could feel the change in the air. Linda's smug demeanor had cracked, and I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to bully me anymore. It was time to take this fight to the next level. After the HOA meeting, I felt a surge of adrenaline. Standing up to Linda and questioning her authority had been empowering, but I knew it wasn't enough. The moment I stepped out of the community center, I called Mark, my lawyer, and told him everything that had happened. We've got her rattled, I said, but we need to make this official. I want to file a lawsuit. Mark didn't hesitate. I think you've got a strong case. Between the fines, the harassment, and the way she's been abusing her power, you've got grounds to fight back. That night, we sat down and began gathering all the evidence. The letters, the fines, the email exchanges, and even testimonies from the neighbors who had also been targeted. It was clear Linda wasn't just a tough HOA president. She was a bully who'd used her position to intimidate and harass anyone she didn't like, and that needed to stop. The next morning, we filed the lawsuit. The charges were clear: harassment, abuse of power, and unfair business practices. The HOA had overstepped its boundaries, and Linda had taken it too far. This wasn't just about a few petty fines anymore. It was about accountability and making sure no one else had to suffer because of her. I could already imagine Linda's reaction when she found out. Would she laugh it off? Would she double down on her authority? Either way, I was ready, but I wasn't prepared for what would happen next. Word spread fast around the neighborhood, and when it did, it became clear that Linda's grip on the HOA wasn't as strong as she thought. As soon as the lawsuit was filed, the neighbors started reaching out to me. Some were people I'd barely spoken to before, but now they were showing support. Some were even offering to testify on my behalf. It turns out that I wasn't the only one who'd been treated unfairly. There were others who had been quietly dealing with Linda's petty rules, all of us unknowingly in the same boat. I've been fined for my backyard lights, one neighbor, Karen, told me when we spoke on the phone. And I never even put up any decorations. It's just a string of Christmas lights. And don't even get me started on how she treats my kids. She always says they're too loud in the yard. It's insane. Hearing stories like Karen's made me feel even more determined to win this lawsuit. This wasn't just about me. This was about standing up for everyone Linda had hurt with her petty, controlling tactics. But even with all the support, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Linda had a reputation for being a force to be reckoned with, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, I received an email from her. Probably the most passive-aggressive email I had ever read. She accused me of damaging the community and called me a troublemaker. She said that if I dropped the lawsuit, she would personally ensure that all my fines were dismissed and that I would be left alone. It was the perfect bait. Try to make me feel guilty, try to intimidate me into backing down. But I wasn't about to fall for that. I called Mark immediately. Should I take the deal? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, Mark said, sounding certain. This is her trying to manipulate you. Stick to your guns. If she wants to settle, it's because she knows she's in the wrong. So, I ignored Linda's offer and let her stew in her frustration. Meanwhile, I kept building my case. I met with more neighbors, collected more testimonies, and made sure everything was in order for the next step. There was no turning back now. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone Linda had bullied, everyone who felt helpless under her thumb. I had crossed the point of no return, and I was ready for whatever came next. I knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over, and it was only going to get bigger from here. When I filed the lawsuit, I wasn't sure what to expect. I knew I had a solid case, but I had no idea how the rest of the neighborhood would react. Would they see me as the troublemaker Linda painted me to be? Or would they rally behind me and take a stand against her reign of terror? It didn't take long for the truth to come out. Word spread like wildfire. People I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly reaching out to me, offering support, and sharing their own stories of Linda's overreach. It was incredible to see how many people were just waiting for someone to take action. Thank you for doing this. One neighbor, Mr. Thompson, told me when I bumped into him outside. I've been fined for ridiculous things too, but I've just kept my head down and paid. I didn't know what else to do. But now I feel like maybe we can actually change things. It was like a weight was being lifted off the community's shoulders. I started to realize just how many people had been silently suffering under Linda's iron grip. From the couple with the garden gnomes to the family with the kids who liked to play outside after dark. Linda had been fining people for the smallest infractions, using her power to intimidate and control. The more people I spoke to, the more I learned about the toxic environment Linda had fostered. It wasn't just about the fines, it was about control. She made people feel like they were walking on eggshells in their own homes. People were afraid to hang up a Christmas wreath, mow their lawns too early, or even leave their trash cans out for a few extra hours. Linda's HOA had become a place where conformity was enforced with a heavy hand. The more I heard, the more I realized that this lawsuit was about much more than me. It was about exposing the way Linda had used her position to terrorize the community. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could rule with an iron fist, without anyone questioning their authority. As the weeks passed, more and more people came forward. Karen, the woman with the Christmas lights, offered to testify on my behalf. So did the Johnsons, a young couple with 2 kids who had been fined for playing too loud on a Sunday afternoon. The more witnesses I gathered, the more it became clear that Linda wasn't just targeting me. She was systematically picking on anyone she could get away with, and I wasn't going to let that slide. But even as the community rallied behind me, Linda wasn't backing down. In fact, her behavior only grew more erratic. She sent out an email to the entire neighborhood, trying to rally support for her side of the story. In it, she painted me as a troublemaker who was ruining the neighborhood. She claimed that I was disrupting the peaceful community and putting everyone at risk with my disregard for the rules. It was the same manipulative rhetoric she had been using for years, but now people weren't buying it. "I can't believe she's still trying to paint you as the bad guy," Mark said when I forwarded the email to him. "She's only digging her own grave. The more she pushes, the more people will see through her tactics." Linda's desperate attempts to discredit me were having the opposite effect. Neighbors who had been silent or afraid to speak out were now openly criticizing her. One by one, people started to question the HOA's authority. They realized that they had been living in fear for far too long, and they didn't want to let Linda control them anymore. I was starting to see the real power of community. What had begun as a solo fight for my own home had turned into a battle for everyone who had been unfairly targeted. And with every show of support, I became more determined to see this through to the end. But Linda wasn't done yet. Her attacks were growing more personal, and I could feel the tension mounting. She was losing her grip on the neighborhood, and the more she fought, the more people turned against her. This fight was far from over, but I knew one thing. The community had my back, and together, we were going to bring an end to Linda's reign of terror. As the days passed and the lawsuit gained momentum, Linda's behavior became increasingly erratic. It was as if the pressure was slowly eating away at her, and with each new development, she became more desperate to maintain control over the neighborhood. She wasn't just sending emails anymore. She was holding personal meetings with other homeowners, trying to sway them to her side with exaggerated stories and outright lies. One afternoon, I received an email from Linda that was addressed to the entire neighborhood. It was nothing short of a personal attack. "I have tried to be reasonable with this troublemaker," she wrote, "but he refuses to accept our community's rules. He is disrupting the peace and harmony that we've all worked so hard to maintain. I fear that if we let him get away with this, it will set a dangerous precedent for the future of our HOA. We cannot allow this behavior to continue." The email went on to accuse me of trying to destroy the family-friendly environment of the neighborhood, and said I was trying to tear apart everything the HOA had worked for. She called me a reckless and disruptive individual who didn't care about anyone else. The worst part? She claimed that I was trying to manipulate my neighbors into believing I was the victim. It was a classic smear campaign. But this time something was different. The people in the neighborhood were no longer afraid of her. The support I had received from my neighbors had given them the courage to stand up to Linda's toxic behavior. Instead of turning against me, as Linda had hoped, they started to question her sanity. "I can't believe she's doing this," Karen said when she forwarded the email to me. "It's like she's unraveling right in front of us. We all know what she's really doing, and we're not going to fall for it." Linda's emails became more frequent, and her tone grew more frantic. She even resorted to calling my personal phone, leaving voicemails where she ranted about how I was destroying the community. She tried to claim that the entire neighborhood was at risk because of my actions, and that I was undermining her leadership. It wasn't just her words, it was her actions, too. Linda began to show up unannounced at neighbors' homes, knocking on doors, trying to convince people that I was a danger to the HOA. She'd stand there, pleading with them to sign petitions against me or attend meetings where she could get them on her side. It was becoming clear to everyone that Linda was no longer acting in the best interest of the community. She was acting out of pure self-preservation. Her attempts to rally support failed miserably. Most people started to distance themselves from her, and many of them reached out to me, offering their apologies for ever supporting her. "Look, we didn't know what she was doing behind the scenes," Mark said one night when we were talking. "We just went along with it because we thought that's how things worked. But now we see it for what it really was. She had all of us under her thumb, and we just went along with it." Even Linda's most loyal supporters started to pull away. At the next HOA meeting, there were noticeably fewer people in attendance. It was as if the weight of her actions had finally hit them. Linda, however, wasn't backing down. She tried to take control of the meeting, but her usual confidence was gone. It was replaced with a frantic energy, one that made it clear she was losing her grip. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, took a deep breath, and addressed the board. I spoke about how the HOA was supposed to be about creating a positive, welcoming environment for everyone in the neighborhood. I talked about how Linda's behavior had made people afraid to speak out, and how she had manipulated the system to make her own personal preferences the law. I didn't just talk about my own struggles. I talked about everyone who had been victimized by her abuse of power. By the end of my speech, the room was silent. Linda looked like she had been slapped in the face, her cheeks flushed with anger and embarrassment. She tried to interrupt, but the room was no longer on her side. The turning point had finally arrived. Linda's attempts to keep control had backfired. As much as she wanted to maintain her position, the truth was catching up to her. The support for my lawsuit continued to grow, and as more people saw through her lies, it became clear that the battle wasn't just mine anymore. It was about righting the wrongs Linda had done to the entire community. At that moment, I realized something. The fight was no longer about my house or the fines. It was about restoring fairness to the neighborhood. And Linda's time as HOA president was coming to an end. But she wasn't going to go down without a fight. The final showdown was coming, and I had no intention of letting her tear the community apart any longer. The day I had been dreading and, in some ways, looking forward to had finally arrived. The courtroom was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the heated emotions that had built up over the past several months. The entire battle had come down to this moment. My lawyer had briefed me thoroughly, and I knew we had a strong case. But walking into the courtroom, with Linda sitting across from me, it all felt real in a way it hadn't before. Linda, along with the rest of the HOA board, sat at the table with their lawyer, their faces tight with tension. She no longer wore the confident, self-assured mask she had always put on at neighborhood meetings. Now she looked vulnerable, a little like a cornered animal. Her eyes kept darting nervously between my lawyer and me, and she fidgeted with her papers, trying to look composed. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly seen her fair share of homeowner disputes, called the court to order. The first few minutes were filled with the usual formalities. The judge outlined the case, the opposing sides introduced themselves, and the basic charges were read aloud. But it wasn't until the lawyer for the HOA spoke that things really began to heat up. Linda's lawyer took the floor first. He was a smooth talker, trying to paint the HOA as a well-meaning organization simply enforcing the rules for the good of the community. He emphasized that the fines were legitimate, that they were all in accordance with the neighborhood's guidelines, and that I had simply been disruptive. It was a speech filled with technicalities, attempting to justify the absurd fines and harassment, but the more he spoke, the more I could see the cracks in his argument. Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath as I stood up, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I started by detailing the history of the fines I had received, pointing out their ridiculous nature. I talked about the overgrown grass, the truck in my driveway, the trash cans left outside for a few hours too long. None of it had anything to do with the overall well-being of the neighborhood, but instead felt like petty power grabs. I explained how Linda had used her position to make my life miserable for personal reasons, and how her actions weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about her controlling the entire neighborhood. I was firm but calm, and I made sure to stick to the facts. The more I spoke, the more the judge's expression shifted. Her neutral face became more skeptical as the details of Linda's overreach were laid bare. When I presented the evidence, emails, photos of the fines, and testimony from other neighbors who had been affected by Linda's reign. There was no denying the truth anymore. The courtroom grew tense when Linda herself was called to testify. I watched her squirm in the witness stand as she tried to explain her actions. Her lawyer's questions were softer now, more defensive, but Linda still couldn't hide the strain in her answers. She tried to stick to the narrative that she was simply protecting the community, but each time she was asked about her personal vendetta against me and others, she faltered. She looked uncomfortable and defensive, and the more she spoke, the more obvious it became that her credibility was crumbling. At one point, the judge interrupted her. "Ms. Wilson, could you please clarify why the fines for such trivial matters were enforced so harshly?" the judge asked, her voice measured but sharp. Linda's face flushed as she stammered for an answer. She attempted to explain that the rules were in place for a reason, but it was clear the judge was losing patience. Linda's attempts to deflect and dismiss the evidence only made her seem more unhinged. She tried to claim that the fines were fair, that they were meant to maintain property values and neighborhood standards, but the more she spoke, the more it seemed like she was just trying to cover up her own power-hungry agenda. I sat back down, feeling a small surge of hope. The judge wasn't buying it, and neither were the few remaining supporters that Linda had in the courtroom. The final blow came when my lawyer called up several neighbors to testify. Karen, Mark, and a few others gave compelling testimonies, explaining how Linda had created a toxic atmosphere in the community. They spoke about the fear they'd lived with, knowing that any small infraction would lead to fines or worse. It was clear. Linda wasn't just enforcing rules, she was terrorizing the neighborhood. The crowd was behind me, and I could feel the shift in the room. Linda's lawyer tried to argue that the fines had been legitimate and in line with the HOA's regulations. But at this point, even he seemed to know the tide had turned. His objections were weak, and the judge barely paid attention to him. After what felt like an eternity, the judge called for a recess before delivering her decision. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. Linda was seething, her face contorted with frustration, while I felt a strange calm. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I felt like I had a real chance at winning. I knew that whatever the outcome, I had already taken back some of my dignity, and I had exposed Linda for what she truly was. Now, it was just a matter of waiting to see if the court would make it official. The recess was agonizing, but I knew that the end of the fight was near. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the entire neighborhood, for everyone who had been wronged by Linda and her overbearing rules. When the judge finally returned to the bench, the air in the courtroom was charged. Everyone was waiting for the final word, and it was about to come. The verdict was coming, and it was going to change everything. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as the judge returned to the bench, her robe sweeping across the floor. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The tension in the room was palpable, not just from me, but from everyone who had watched the proceedings unfold. Linda was sitting rigidly, her face set in a grimace, clearly bracing herself for the decision. I couldn't help but wonder if she had any idea how much her actions had backfired. The judge cleared her throat and began speaking. After reviewing the evidence presented by both parties, and considering the testimony provided by the witnesses, it is clear to this court that the actions taken by the defendant, Ms. Linda Wilson, and the Homeowners Association under her leadership, have been both excessive and unwarranted. The fines levied against Mr. Your Last Name were not only disproportionate to the infractions cited, but there is also substantial evidence suggesting a personal agenda at play. I held my breath, not daring to move. Linda's face turned a deep shade of red, and I could see her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. The rest of the courtroom seemed to collectively inhale, waiting for the next words. The judge continued, "Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. The HOA is hereby ordered to cease all current and future fines that have been unjustly imposed on Mr. Your Last Name. All fines previously paid will be refunded in full, and the HOA will be required to pay legal fees associated with this case. Furthermore, Ms. Wilson is to step down from her position as president of the Homeowners Association, and a new election will be held for the board members." I almost couldn't believe it. The judge had ruled in my favor on every point. The room around me seemed to exhale in unison, and a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. I could feel a grin tugging at the corners of my mouth, but I kept it in check, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. The relief was overwhelming. Linda's reaction was something I'll never forget. Her face was a picture of disbelief, eyes wide, mouth agape, as the reality of the decision sank in. She sat frozen for a moment, then shot up from her seat as if to protest. But her lawyer quickly put a hand on her arm, signaling her to remain silent. The judge raised her hand, silencing the room. "Ms. Wilson," she said sharply, "your actions have disrupted not only the plaintiff's life but the peace and well-being of the entire neighborhood. You are hereby removed from your position, effective immediately. It is time for the homeowners to have a board that serves their interests, not one that abuses its power." The room was still, but I could hear a faint murmur of agreement from the few people who had attended the trial. My lawyer smiled, but there was no smugness in it, just a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. Linda stood there for a moment, clearly weighing her options. Her face was bright red with fury, but she seemed to realize that her time as HOA president was over. She turned, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she stormed out of the courtroom, not sparing me another glance. The judge's final words were for me. "Mr. Your last name, while your case has been heard and ruled upon, I would also like to remind you that the new board will take time to establish its policies. Please be patient as the community works to restore balance. The judgment today is a step in that direction, but I encourage you to work toward a peaceful resolution with your neighbors moving forward." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. While I had won, the battle was not truly over. The neighborhood still needed healing. Linda's departure might have removed the main source of tension, but there were still others to consider, and the HOA itself would need to rebuild its reputation. As I walked out of the courtroom with my lawyer, I felt a strange sense of finality. I had done what I set out to do. I had stood up against an overbearing authority and fought for my rights, and won. But I also realized that my fight wasn't just about winning in court. It was about setting a precedent for anyone who had ever been mistreated or bullied by someone in power. When I returned home, I was greeted by my neighbors, who had gathered outside to show their support. The news had already spread like wildfire through the community. They all congratulated me, and several of them even apologized for not speaking out sooner. I realized that this wasn't just my victory, it was theirs too. They had all suffered in silence under Linda's rule, and now, they too could begin to rebuild. That night, I sat on my porch, the same porch that had once felt like a battleground. The air felt lighter, the neighborhood quieter. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The nightmare of the HOA was finally over, and I had come out on top. But I knew one thing for sure, this experience had changed me. I would never again stand idly by when I saw injustice. Whether it was a petty HOA fine or something bigger, I now knew that the power of standing up for what's right could never be underestimated. The fight wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who had ever been pushed around, for anyone who had ever been silenced. We had all won.